Hello, I'm Emma. My life has always followed a predictable pattern: college, job, saving money, and the hope of eventually owning a small place to call my own. I work at a travel agency, which is quite ironic since I spend my days surrounded by images of places I've never been to. My routine was simple: work, home, sleep, and repeat. Then, one day, out of nowhere, I received a call from Oliver, an old college friend. "Hey Emma, long time no see. Guess what? I'm organizing a camping trip this weekend. You should come," he excitedly proposed as soon as I answered the phone. I hesitated, but before I could object, he added, "Come on, Emma. It's just a weekend. You need a break. What's the point of selling dreams if you never live one yourself?" Oliver was persuasive, and knowing I would eventually agree, I relented. Okay, send me the details," I said, slightly regretting my decision as we ended the call. However, a part of me felt a flicker of excitement, something I hadn't felt in quite some time. The rest of the week flew by in a whirl of preparations. I found my old camping gear and purchased new hiking boots since my old ones were beyond repair, and by Friday, I felt as prepared as I could be. The next morning was crisp and clear. I drove to our meeting spot, a quaint coffee shop where our group was gathering. Oliver, ever the lively one, was already there, welcoming everyone with his loud hellos. He introduced me to the group. "This is Emma, guys. We went to college together. She's a pro at booking your dream vacation, but never takes one herself." I forced a smile through the group's laughter. As we began our hike, the reality of what I had signed up for started to sink in. The path was steeper than I anticipated. My backpack felt like a ton, and the new boots were torture devices. About an hour in, I was seriously reconsidering my life choices. That's when I met Dylan, a friend of a friend. He was tall, with an easygoing smile, and noticed my struggle. "First time hiking in a while?" he asked, seeing my clumsy steps. "Is it that obvious?" I replied, out of breath. He laughed and offered to carry my backpack to ease my climb. I hesitated but accepted, feeling both relieved and embarrassed. "Thanks, I guess I'm not as fit as I thought," I admitted. As we walked, Dylan shared stories of his travels and misadventures, which made the time pass more quickly. I found myself laughing more than I had in months. By the time we set up camp, I was tired but invigorated. The evening was filled with campfire stories and marshmallows. Dylan stayed close, and we talked well into the night under the starlit sky. Waking up in a tent was unusual for me, but there I was on Sunday morning, stiff but excited by the chirping birds outside. I put on my boots, which felt slightly less torturous than the day before, and stepped out into the fresh morning air. Dylan was already up, making coffee on a small camp stove. He flashed a smile as I approached. "Morning, Emma. Sleep well?" he asked. "Better than I expected," I replied, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "What's that smell?" "Coffee," he said. "Thought it might help kickstart the day. Want some?" Gratefully, I accepted the warm cup, sipping carefully as the caffeine began to revive me. As everyone else began to wake up, Oliver called us to gather around. "All right, team, today's trek is a bit tougher," he started, outlining the day's plans. "Let's stick together and remember, nobody gets left behind, okay?" I glanced at Dylan, hoping he would stay close. He caught on, giving me a subtle nod, and we began our hike at a brisk pace through the increasingly dense forest. The trail was strewn with roots and rocks, demanding our full attention. Dylan walked by my side, engaging me in a continuous flow of conversation that distracted me from my sore muscles. "So, Emma, what made you finally agree to a trip like this?" he inquired as we tackled a particularly challenging section of the path. I chuckled. Oliver was on my case about it. He joked that I was turning into office furniture. Guess I needed to prove him wrong. Eventually, the path led us to a stunning clearing, offering a majestic view of the distant mountains. We paused for a break, everyone catching their breath and admiring the view. I dropped my backpack with a heavy thud and plopped down next to it. Dylan joined me, handing over a water bottle. "You're doing great, Emma." "Seriously," he encouraged. "Thanks, Dylan. This is tougher than I thought, but I'm really glad I came," I admitted, taking in the surrounding natural beauty. We enjoyed a few moments of peaceful silence, appreciating the tranquility of the wilderness. It was a new experience for me, this quiet companionship, and I found myself not wanting it to end. As we prepared to resume our hike, Dylan offered his hand to help me up. Ready for the next part? As ready as I'll ever be, I replied, accepting his help. The morning flew by in a blur of lush greenery and occasional wildlife sightings. As we began packing up to return to camp, Dylan stayed back with me. Hey Emma, there's a small waterfall not too far from here. Want to check it out before we head back? Although my body yearned for rest, curiosity got the better of me, and I agreed. Sure, why not? Lead the way. That detour felt like an adventure within an adventure. The waterfall was a breathtaking hidden gem, secluded from the well-trodden path. Watching the water cascade down, I felt a profound shift inside me. Perhaps it was the sheer beauty of the place, or maybe it was the company I was with, but I knew this moment would stay with me forever. Life has a way of appending your plans. 3 years after that camping trip, Dylan and I got married in a simple, joyful ceremony, though his mother, Mrs. Zoe, barely managed to smile, never hiding her disapproval of me. 3 years later, Dylan proposed a significant change. Emma, we should consider moving in with my mom. Since Dad passed, she's been all alone in that big house, and I worry about her. I was chopping vegetables for dinner and nearly cut myself at his suggestion. Live with your mom? Dylan, you know she isn't fond of me. He ran a hand through his hair, exasperated. I know it's not ideal, but she's my mom, and we need to take care of her. Reluctantly, I agreed, out of love for Dylan. The day we moved in, Mrs. Zoe greeted us with a stiff smile and a list of house rules she had prepared. I tried to stay positive, but the tension was palpable that evening. As Dylan was busy arranging our bedroom, his mother took the opportunity to corner me in the kitchen. Emma, remember this house is still mine, and I expect it to be kept to a certain standard, she stated, eyeing my method of organizing the pantry shelves. I responded with a nod, keeping my composure. Of course, Mrs. Zoe. I'll do my utmost. She sighed, a touch of impatience in her voice. Please make an effort to maintain cleanliness, and don't think it's all right to simply relax all day. There's much to be done here. Her remarks were cutting, but I managed to hold back my emotions. I understand. I'll make sure to keep everything up to your standards. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the challenge of living with Mrs. Zoe was just as I had anticipated. She constantly commented on everything I did. For my cooking, it's too spicy, Emma. Not everyone wants their taste buds assaulted. To my laundry techniques, you're folding those sheets incorrectly. On a particularly difficult day, Dylan found me in tears while I was deep cleaning the kitchen floor. What's going on? He asked, kneeling beside me. It's just your mom. No matter how hard I try, she's never pleased with anything I do. He put his arm around me, offering comfort. I'm sorry, Emma. I see how much effort you're putting in. I'll have a word with her, okay? His discussion with her seemed to help somewhat, as Mrs. Zoe started to hold back on her critiques. She remained distant, yet the barrage of daily criticisms lessened. Over time, we managed to find a strained sort of rhythm in our cohabitation. The topic of children soon arose. I longed to start a family, but after months of no success, anxiety began to set in. During a quiet moment one evening, while washing dishes with Dylan, I broached my worries. Dylan, do you think something might be wrong? Should we consider seeing a doctor? He continued scrubbing a plate, avoiding eye contact. I'm not sure, Emma. Let's not jump to conclusions. These things often take time. The lack of progress was disheartening, but he seemed reluctant to delve deeper. Amid these trials, I sought comfort in creating a space within the house. I took up gardening, an endeavor I'd always imagined undertaking. To my surprise, even Mrs. Zoe seemed to acknowledge my efforts, albeit gruffly, on one occasion. You seem to have a real talent for gardening, she commented one day as she watched me prune the roses. Grateful for any semblance of approval, I smiled warmly. Thank you, Mrs. Zoe. I appreciate your kind words. In an unexpected turn, Dylan suggested I leave my job to focus on home life, and I agreed, becoming a full-time homemaker. My days were filled with juggling household responsibilities, caring for Mrs. Zoe, and managing the shifting dynamics of our household. Dylan's behavior began to change as well. He stayed late at work more often, too tired to engage when he returned, and frequently opted to sleep in the spare room, citing the need for undisturbed rest. One evening, as I was repairing a leaky faucet, Dylan's sister, Abigail, visited unexpectedly. Still the devoted wife in this old place. Emma, she scoffed, scanning the dim kitchen. I defended my new life. It's not as bad as it seems, Abigail. You get used to it. She let out a scornful laugh that resonated through the room. Typical for you, isn't it? Old-fashioned and lonely. Seems to suit you perfectly. Before I could answer her, she quickly turned to her mom. Mom, I need some money for the usual things, you know the drill. Mrs. Zoe, without skipping a beat, reached for her checkbook. Her hands were trembling, but her resolve was clear as she wrote out a check for her daughter. Shortly after Abigail's visit, Mrs. Zoe's health began to decline significantly. One day, she called me into her room, her voice much weaker than before. Emma, could you help me with my bath today? I'm really struggling, she asked softly. I nodded, fighting back tears, and replied gently, Of course, Mrs. Zoe. As I supported her, her typically stern demeanor softened. By the time we finished, tears were streaming down her face. Thank you, dear. It seems my daughter can't be bothered to help, she murmured. It's no trouble at all, I soothed her, assisting her back to her room. That day was a turning point in our relationship. She began to view me more as a daughter than merely a guest staying in her home. However, while I grew closer to Mrs. Zoe, her son Dylan became more aloof. I once overheard him talking about a new apartment he had bought close to his workplace. Later, I casually asked him, Could you show me the apartment sometime? Trying to keep the tone light. It's just a regular place, Emma. There's nothing special about it. It's not a museum, he snapped, quickly shutting down the conversation. His coldness was a sting, but what truly hurt came several days later, when Mrs. Zoe summoned me. With urgent whispers, she revealed, He bought that apartment with my money, Emma. It's in my name, and he even uses my savings for the bills. My heart dropped. Why would he do that? I asked in disbelief. She shook her head, her eyes filled with sorrow. I'm not sure, dear, but be cautious. There's something not right with Dylan. Throughout these difficult times, Mrs. Zoe, my unexpected ally, began treating me with a newfound warmth. One relaxed, sunlit afternoon as we sat together in the parlor, I broached a subject I had been contemplating. Mrs. Zoe, have you thought about giving this old place a makeover? I asked. Her eyes roamed the room, lingering on the faded photographs and peeling wallpaper. Perhaps a little refreshment wouldn't hurt, she admitted, her voice tinged with rare nostalgia. Encouraged, I proposed a more thorough transformation. How about we shake things up? Some fresh paint, revitalized furniture, new curtains. It could transform the atmosphere here. Intrigued, she raised an eyebrow. What do you have in mind? Energized by her interest, I detailed my ideas for vibrant paint and updated furniture. Mrs. Zoe nodded thoughtfully. That sounds lovely. It's been forever since we've changed anything here. Think you can handle that? Absolutely, I assured her, excitement rising within me. The following day, equipped with paint samples and fabric swatches, I set out to revitalize the old mansion. The work was demanding but fulfilling, infusing new life into these old walls. As I was removing wallpaper in the dining room, Mrs. Zoe stopped by, leaning on her cane. You're committed to this, aren't you? She noted, watching me work. I am, I confirmed, grinning through my sweat. This place will feel completely transformed. She laughed, a sound so infrequent that it almost startled me. At this rate, I might not even recognize my own home, she remarked with a wry smile. Days melted into weeks as we gradually transformed the residence. The once somber and dim hues were replaced by bright, inviting colors. We tore out the old, musty carpets to reveal stunning hardwood floors beneath, which we polished until they gleamed. Dylan's visits became even scarcer, But one evening, he unexpectedly arrived while I was hanging new curtains in the living room. "What the hell is all this? What have you done to my house?" he exploded, his gaze rapidly taking in the renovated space. Just then, Mrs. Zoe entered the room. "It's my house, Dylan. I want it to be beautiful." "Emma is doing an excellent job," she declared firmly. Dylan's face tightened with frustration. "Fine," he snapped, before storming off to another part of the house. Despite his outburst, we continued our work. Mrs. Zoe and I chose new furniture, opting for lighter, more contemporary pieces that still honored the home's original charm. Each new piece seemed to elevate her spirits, and mine as well. Just as we were settling into our refreshed surroundings, Mrs. Zoe's health abruptly deteriorated. One morning, I found her slumped over in her chair, barely able to speak. I immediately pressed the panic button, and within hours, we were in the emergency room. The doctors, moving swiftly around her, soon confirmed she had suffered a stroke. She was quickly taken for further treatment, leaving me pacing the sterile hospital corridors alone. Neither Dylan nor Abigail appeared during her hospital stay. Over the following weeks, I was her constant visitor. I sat by her bedside daily, holding her hand, talking about the house to lift her spirits, while she looked on blankly, her body weak, her spirit dimmed. When she finally returned home, she was a shadow of her former self, confined to her bed, her movements sluggish and her speech slurred. It was on her first day back that Dylan and Abigail decided to make an appearance. They brushed past me in the hallway and went straight to Mrs. Zoe's room, where they began discussing her assets as though she were not even there. "Mom's got that savings account. We should look into that," Abigail remarked, rifling through some documents she shouldn't have possessed. "Yeah, and the house. We need to start thinking about what to do with it," Dylan added, not bothering to lower his voice. Mrs. Zoe's eyes brimmed with tears, her hands shaking. Witnessing her vulnerability tore at my heart. I couldn't restrain myself any longer. "Can you three stop? She's right here, listening to all this," I burst out. Dylan turned to me, his face contorting in annoyance. "This is family business, Emma. Stay out of it," he snapped. Abigail scoffed. "Yeah, just because you play nurse doesn't mean you have a say." Their words stung, but I refused to let them intimidate me or diminish my resolve. "She's my family too, and I'm not going to let you treat her like this," I countered firmly. From that day forward, I dedicated myself even more to her care. I researched stroke recovery, learned exercises to help her regain mobility, and regularly massaged her limbs to prevent them from stiffening. Gradually, she began to show signs of improvement. It was slow and laborious, but progress was evident. She started eating on her own, a determined look on her face each time she attempted to walk with my support. Dylan and Abigail observed her recovery with evident displeasure, as every bit of progress Mrs. Zoe made seemed to thwart their plans for her assets. One evening, after a particularly strenuous set of exercises, as I helped Mrs. Zoe back into bed, her grateful smile told me all I needed to know about her appreciation for my efforts. She gazed up at me with clarity in her eyes that I hadn't seen in weeks. "Thank you, Emma," she whispered, her voice weak yet resolute. "You're my real family." It had been a relatively peaceful year. The mansion slowly transformed into a warm home under my care. But this peace was shattered the morning I discovered Mrs. Zoe had passed away in her sleep. Her departure was as quiet and dignified as the gentle side of her I had grown to cherish. The funeral felt surreal, a blur of faces and condolences. I was in the parlor, greeting mourners still in a daze, when Dylan walked in. The surprise wasn't just from seeing him after his long absences over the past year, but from the woman by his side and the children clinging to her. "This is my wife, Camila, and these are my children." Dylan introduced them plainly as if no explanation was needed. His words cut sharply through the hushed whispers of the crowd. Then he turned to me, his voice cold and dismissive. "Emma, you need to leave. We'll be moving in." I stood frozen, trying to digest his words when Abigail's laughter pierced through my shock. "Finally, this house will see some proper life again." Before I could gather myself, Mr. Jackson, the notary, summoned us to the living room for the reading of the will, a heavy tension enveloping us all. Mr. Jackson pulled out the documents from his briefcase. "Let's proceed with the reading of Marjorie Zoe's last will and testament," he announced. Dylan and Abigail positioned themselves confidently, seemingly prepared to claim their inheritance. I remained by the window, the gravity of the moment pressing down on me. Marjorie Zoe declared in her last will and testament, Mr. Jackson began, "To Emma, who has been more than a daughter to me, I leave all my property, including the mansion and all my financial assets. Furthermore, the apartment purchased by my son Dylan will also revert to Emma, as it was acquired with funds I provided." The room fell deathly silent. Dylan's face flushed with anger, his fists balled up. "This is ridiculous. You must have forced her into this, Emma." Abigail was quick to support her brother, her tone harsh and accusatory. "You're nothing but a gold digger. Mom was old and confused. You took advantage of her." Despite my racing heart, I maintained my composure. "I didn't force anyone. I cared for her when you wouldn't," I responded calmly. Mr. Jackson adjusted his glasses, clearing his throat. "There is also a video statement from Marjorie, if you will," he said, setting up a laptop. The screen flickered on, and Mrs. Zoe appeared, looking frail but determined. "If you're watching this, I am no longer here. I have left everything to Emma. In these past years, she has shown me kindness, compassion, and loyalty more than my children ever did. This is my thank you to her, my final wish." As the video concluded, the room was enveloped in silence. Dylan looked like he was on the verge of exploding with rage, while Abigail appeared to shrink back, her earlier bravado dissipating. Dylan turned desperately to Mr. Jackson. "We can contest this, right? There has to be a way." Mr. Jackson closed the folder with a definitive snap. "You can try," but Marjorie was of sound mind when she made her decision. After the legal process concluded, I managed to finalize my divorce from Dylan. The house and the apartment he used for his escapades became mine legally. Dylan, along with his new family, wandered from one temporary home to another. Our mutual friends occasionally updated me on his struggles, but I found no joy in his misfortunes. Abigail, too, faced her share of difficulties. She had gambled on inheriting her mother's wealth and lost, leaving her buried in debt. One afternoon, she appeared on my doorstep, looking worn and defeated, a stark contrast to her usual confident demeanor. "Emma, I need help," she said plainly, without any pretense. Recalling all the bitter exchanges and her scorn, I responded, "I can't help you, Abigail. You've made your choices." Her eyes flickered with a blend of anger and desperation. "You're enjoying this, aren't you? Watching us crumble." I shook my head, a pang of pity stirring within me despite everything. "I don't take pleasure in your struggles, Abigail, but you need to resolve your issues yourself." In a bid to preserve the legacy of Mrs. Zoe, I decided to transform the old mansion into a boutique hotel named Marjorie's. This project was a tribute to Mrs. Zoe, aimed at keeping her spirit and passion for the estate alive by turning it into a vibrant hub of activity. I oversaw everything from renovations to marketing, infusing my efforts with dedication and attention to detail. One evening, as I sat in Mrs. Zoe's beloved garden, I contemplated the future. I envisioned Marjorie's not just as a hotel but as a cornerstone of the community, a place that would foster connections and host local events, becoming an integral part of the area's social fabric.